Today I'm going to be giving you guys a very cool crash course on the Jobava London. Full of traps, very easy to play. We're going to be using chessreps.com to learn this. So it starts off with pawn to d4, the regular response pawn to d5. And we're always going to be playing the move knight c3. Like if you're a Jobava London player, you play the move pawn d4, your next move is going to be knight c3. Now, the very cool thing about this is the first way to punish people is, knight to f6 is the very typical move, especially when persons play e5, they always just take out their two knights. But against the Joe Barber, that's incorrect. So after they play knight f6, you go bishop to f4, and again, all the notes are on the side right here. So you're going to know why you're playing the move. So it's not about just memorizing stuff. Once they go knight c6, this is already immediately losing because this pawn on c7 become weak. So what we're going to do is break principles, move the same piece more than once, hit them with knight to b5, and there's basically nothing black could do to defend the c7 pawn. So he decided to play the move pawn to e5, just trying to block the fact that we're attacking c7. Well, this is where things gets fancy. I mean, it's a free pawn, but we're not going to take with the pawn. And notice when you play the incorrect move, it tells you that you're incorrect. You're actually going to be taking with the bishop because it keeps the threat on c7. And then once the knight takes, now you take on e5, attack the knight, which is one of the main defenders of d5. Now you're probably saying, but the pawn on d5 is still guarded. The thing is, though, thanks to this knight on b5, we have a beautiful sacrificial idea. Queen takes d5, sacrificing the queen. Because once the opponent's queen takes, that's when we jump in with knight c7 check. And this is called a royal fork, by the way. The king now has to move. We grab the queen, and that's one of the first line in the Jobava London. Another very typical idea that you guys are going to see after this knight to f6 move is after you put the bishop on f4, what if instead of playing the move knight c6, blundering to knight b5, they decide to play bishop f5? Now, what I want to teach you guys is anytime you're playing the Jobava London and you notice that they put their bishop on f5, that's when you're going to play the move pawn to f3. Now, what's the purpose of pawn to f3? We're basically trying to play moves like pawn to g4, pawn to h4, and they could actually get their bishop trapped doing this. So, for example, pawn to e6, that's a fine move, by the way. You hit them with g4, the bishop has to move. Now you hit them with h4. Now, once you play this move pawn to h5, keep in mind, we were threatening to trap the bishop. So, any other normal development move, you hit them with pawn to h5, and you're just winning the game. So, after a move like pawn to h6, now they're trying to prevent the bishop from getting trapped because if we play h5, the bishop goes back to h7, and that's when we're going to just play pawn to e3, continue with our development. And once they play this move, bishop to d6, now our whole idea is to defend our bishop. Now, as you see in the notes, if we put the knight on e2, it blocks in our own bishop. And that's the reason why we're going to play the move knight h3. And after the trade, we hit the bishop, but it does not stop there. Now, if you take a look on this file, we're able to play the move pawn to g5, hitting the knight. And once the knight move, it looks as if they have two pieces guarding g6. But because the bishop is pinned to the rook, we're able to get away by moving a pawn on g6. Keep in mind, the bishop is never able to take because we're going to simply win their rook. So what we do here is we simply just take on e6, and we're actually going to be winning the opponent's rook. Because once we take on e6, if the queen moves anywhere, then this is just a fork. But if the queen goes here, knight takes d5, and that's us learning the other line. Because there's nothing they could do to prevent the fork. And if this knight goes to a6, bishop takes a6, it's just a removing the guard tactic. Now, another very important line that we're working on putting on Chessreps is what if they play the King's Indian defense against the Joe Baba? Like, this is what you want. Knight f6, knight c3, pawn d6. I want you guys to keep in mind that one of the main reasons why we play knight c3 is to play pawn to e4. Now, they continue with the regular King's Indian move, pawn to g6. Now you play bishop to f4. Again, it's the regular Joe Baba move. And bishop to g7 here. And it may sound weird, but white is already winning. Once you play the move pawn to e5, hit the knight, it's actually a cruel mistake taking on e5. Now, everyone usually takes on e5 because it's the natural move. They take on e5 and then trade the queens off the board. But little do they know that it actually allows our rook to get in the game. And people usually play moves like knight h5 to hit the bishop, but we play the move knight d5. It guards the bishop, but the idea is not necessarily to guard the bishop. He's actually losing the rook here. There's no protecting the rook. If the king ever comes over trying to guard the rook, it goes on the same line as our rook. So now we could think about moves like knight b6. And that's just a very nice discovered attack on the opponent's king. If they try to play the move knight to a6, protecting the pawn on c7, also a blunder because now we hit them with a removing the guard tactic, taking the knight first. And once they take, we take on c7. And in these types of position, the plan is actually not necessarily to go for the rook because once the king steps over, rook to d1 will be a checkmate. With that being said, whenever you go knight d5, if they take on f4 and you take on c7 with check and they move the king, don't take their rook because that's just a checkmate. Now I'm going to be showing you guys how to use the Jobava in actual games. All right, so we're playing some Jobava London games. It starts with d4, and our next move is always going to be knight c3. Whether they play d5 or knight f6, just play knight c3, knowing that your next move will be bishop to f4. And as you guys saw in the intro, there's some crazy traps that could happen in this line. Pawn to e6 is not bad. We're still going to be playing bishop to f4 here, and our goal is just to develop. Like, I don't want you guys to be playing this hoping to get the traps, but just aim to develop all your pieces. So bishop to f4 was played. Well, bishop to d6 was played, and that's the first slight mistake because, for one, you don't want to be blocking in your bishops like this. Once I take on d6 and he takes back, how is he going to play? How is he going to move his d pawn in order to develop his bishop on c8? Now, from here, what black needed to do was to play d5 as early as possible. Being a Jobava London player, one of the main reasons why you put your knight on c3 is not necessarily to go for these traps, but we're actually trying to play pawn to e4. So knight c3 prepares us to play pawn to e4, and the opponent decided to castle the king, and we're just going to be continuing with our development. Let's go bishop to d3, and I'm putting my bishop on d3 because I want to point my bishop towards the opponent's king. Like, we spoke about this a lot. If we're trying to attack, we need to attack the pawns and the squares that is around the opponent's king. Knight to c6 was played. Let's look on the opponent's last move. It is attacking our pawn on d4, which means we're going to simply play the move knight f3, guarding the pawn, regular development stuff. And if you look on the position again, Black's main issue, apart from the fact that this is just ugly looking double pawns, is he needs to figure out how he's going to be developing that light squared bishop. Queen to a5. You don't want to be developing your queen this early. I mean, it's not a bad move though, to be honest, because my plan was actually to play the move pawn to e5, but now the opponent has one, two, three pieces on the e5 square, which means if I play e5, he's gonna be winning a pawn. What am I gonna do about that? Now, castling is a good move. Like, if you suggest that I need to castle in this position, that's a good move. But I'm gonna choose to play the move queen to e2, so that way it still threatens to play pawn to e5 and chase away the opponent's knight, but then it kept my options open on where I wanted to castle. But then he decided to play pawn to e5, which is a nice move. Because now if I push, he's going to go knight d4, takes, and then he's winning a pawn or even a piece rather. So I think now is the time to get our king out the center of the board, and I'm actually setting up some crazy traps here. Like, I want you guys to notice that he has two pieces attacking my d4 pawn, and I only have my knight guarding the d4 pawn. Another thing that I want you guys to notice is the fact that my pawn on a2 is only being guarded by the knight, which means, and now my knight is under attack, but as I'm saying, I'm setting up a lot of traps. Now I'm actually going to play the move knight to d5. So I'm down by a pawn, and my intention is to sacrifice another pawn. Now, you guys are wondering, why am I doing all of this? For one, I'm trying to get rid of this knight. Usually, the knight on f6 or any minor pieces that is around the opponent's king, those are like the main defensive pieces for the opponent. So he decided to take on a2, which, that was definitely a mistake. Because now once I take on f6, it comes with an immediate check. And because it comes with an immediate check, the opponent is now forced to take on. Well, now I'm just ahead by a piece. I have to be careful though. I'm not trying to allow any draws. So what I'm seeing is if he checks here and I play king up, he may want to check on if but then I'm able to block the check with pawn to c3. So that was just bad. I also have another plan, which is crazy. Remember what I told you guys about the pawns and the squares around the opponent's king? I'm actually thinking of sacrificing my knight. It's actually a Greek gift sacrifice, but I'm not using the bishop. I'm using the knight. It's literally the same thing. If I sat my knight on h7 and the king takes, knight g5 is going to be leading to a checkmate. Slightly risky though, because remember, the opponent wants to give some checks, but we already calculated how we're going to stop these checks. So let's sacrifice the knight on h7. Now his rook is also under attack. I'm assuming he's going to check here, and then after king up, he's going to check here, and then I'm going to block the check, and then he's going to notice that he has no more checks. And one of the main mistakes that he made in this game was to play bishop to d6 because he's basically playing the game without a light squared bishop. He didn't even take the knight, which is crazy. This guy's playing badly, to be honest. But let's just continue with our attack. What I'm trying to do is get my queen to checkmate on h7. So I'm actually going to play the move knight g5. I'm not necessarily threatening f7 because the queen guards it. What I'm really threatening is queen h5. And again, I'm not worried about any check on a1 because once I play king up, he's only going to have one more check. So knight e5 was played. Maybe he thinks he needs to guard the pawn. Maybe he didn't see that the queen was already guarding the pawn. But once we play queen to h5, we're basically putting the queen on the same line as the opponent's king, which means this is going to be leading to a checkmate. In fact, this is going to be leading to a crazy checkmate. Again, because my queen is on the same line as his king, we're now thinking about discovered attacks, and then he plays the move pawn to g6. Now it's just over. For one, my queen is under attack. So anywhere I move my knight, it's gonna come with check, but I'm gonna lose the queen. However, what if I just move my queen to h6? Now, when I move my queen to h6, my queen is no longer on. Oh, he's actually able to play knight g4. Oh yeah, I was about to say he's not able to play knight g4 because he's blundering f7, but the queen guards f7. But he needs to find knight g4 and attack the queen again. And then at that point, I'm gonna hit him with queen h4, and then I'm gonna do the discovered attack and use it to deliver a checkmate. So he found it, knight g4. Let's go queen h4. I'm also defending against any forks that he may have on f2. And then he played knight to e3. So here's what he's trying to do. It looks like it's a blunder, which it is. But once I take the knight and he takes back, he wants to check on a1, and then the pawn is going to be protecting the d2 square, and that's going to be a checkmate. But the fact that my queen is on the same line as his king, I mean, this has to count for something. I'm sure I have some checkmates here. Okay, the first thing that I'm going to do is, well, do I take the free knight first? Okay, let's just play knight f6 check. This is a discovered attack on the king, and because his rook on e8 is unprotected, I'm also able to win the rook with a check because he decided to put his king. Well, he didn't decide. It's actually the only move. Now, if I'm thinking about queen to h7, but then he takes, and I'm just not seeing any checkmates, to be honest. So let's just take the free rook with check. So he still has to react to that move. And then once he moves the king, I'm trying to make queen h8 work. But then there's king e7. I'm also looking on additional checks like queen f6, but then he takes my knight. And I'm never able to take on f7 due to this very annoying queen. That being said, I mean, I'm ahead by 7 points. So let's just take the pawn on d6, not taking the knight because of the little tricks. If he decides to take my rook, I don't mind. I'm ahead by so many material, and I'm basically trying to go for checkmate here. And then he decides to take the rook, which means my queen is under attack. Yo, it's actually crazy. I'm ahead by 7 points. I'm trying to find the mate. I'm not seeing any mate. But let's be patient about it. We're going to check on h8. The king has to go to e7. We're going to check on e5, and that should lead to something. So let's check on h8. King e7 is forced. Now we check on e5 because I'm also trying to protect my knight, and now the king has to go to either d8 or f8. He decides to go to d8, and okay, now there's a checkmate because the queen actually covers this diagonal. And the fact that the queen covers this diagonal and it also prevents the king from escaping, I'm actually able to hit him with knight takes f7 check. Now, if you notice, the king actually has nowhere to go. So the only reason why this is not a checkmate is because the queen has to take. And then once the queen takes, that's just a checkmate. All right, let's play some more Jobava game. Let's go pawn d4. Pawn to c6 was played. This is actually very interesting. We're still going to continue with knight to c3, and I'm assuming he's going to play the move pawn to d5. Like maybe this is a Karakan player who plays c6, d5 against everything. But let's just continue with our regular Jobava setup. We're going to be developing our queenside pieces, moving the queen to d2, castling the king on the queen side, and then start the attack on the king side. Very simple and typical idea. Knight to f6. And okay, now let's just get the king out the center of the board first. So the good thing about the Jobava is we also managed to get our king to safety. He decides to play the move knight b6, which is not bad. And remember, it's very important that you pay attention to your half of the board. The guy wants to play knight to c4, which, it would attack the queen. So you could say it's a bit annoying. With that being said, I'm thinking of playing pawn to e4. And then if after he takes pawn f3. Let's just play pawn to e3. Let's just be patient. If he puts the knight on c4, I'm just going to take on c4. And if he takes back on c4, then, he's helping us to be developed. Now, one main thing that I want you guys to keep in mind is whenever you see this bishop on f5, we're trying to play f3, followed by g4, followed by h4. And he could get his bishop trapped. On to e6, and here's how I like to do it. Keep in mind, if I play pawn to g4, he pulls the bishop back to g6, pawn to h4. This works. Like, if you do it, it's fine. I like to start by playing the move pawn to h4. Because when I start by playing the move pawn to h4, it's not obvious that I'm trying to trap his bishop, and he fell right into it. We already took care of knight c4. The bishop on f1 was covering that, so let's just take because he was attacking the queen. And then once he takes back, just like that, we're winning his bishop. Just like what we saw in the intro. Pawn to g4, and his bishop is now trapped. Because, okay, there's no way for the bishop forward. And once he pulls the bishop back to g6, we hit him with pawn h5. And, I mean, that's just game. And that's why he decided to sacrifice his knight. So he's like, okay, I'm going to lose a bishop. Might as well get 2 pawns for it. So let's take the knight. The bishop is going to take, and my rook is under attack. But okay, let's just develop the knight. I block the attack. I develop the knight. We're ahead by a piece. His king is also still in the center of the board. Queen to b6 was played. Just check to see where that piece is pointing. Maybe he's trying to castle his king on the queen side. But seeing that this bishop is unprotected, let's play the move rook to g1 first and attack the unprotected bishop. I'm assuming he's going to play h5 or probably pull it back. So he did pull the bishop back, but he pulls the bishop back to h5, which is not bad. And because so many of my pieces are developed, I'm going to play the move pawn to e4 with some ideas of playing pawn to d5. And now we're just going for pawn breaks. Like, you guys need to understand pawn breaks and the importance of pawn breaks, and also the drawback principle. Like, he just played the move bishop to e7. Like, he puts his bishop on e7. He didn't really ask what the bishop was doing, which means that's just a pawn. So let's just go ahead and take the free pawn on g7. Maybe he's trying to pull the bishop back to g6 and then put his bishop on f6 and then trap my rook. But because I'm already ahead by 2 points and his king is not safe, that idea is not going to be helping him. Okay, so he took on h4. What I'm noticing is he has 2 unprotected bishop. Luckily, there's no tactic in this position. But what we also know is whenever someone's king is in the center of the board, we want to play moves like pawn to d5 and open the center of the board. That's the purpose of me playing pawn to d5. Now, I'm not expecting him to do this, but if he decides to take everything on d5, then his position is going to be so bad and he's going to be getting checkmated in like the next few moves max. Okay, which is why he played rook to d8. I mean, it would have made way more sense just to castle the king, to be honest. Now, my pawn is pinned. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to push the pawn to d6. All of a sudden, I have a passed pawn, and he needs to be super careful here because if he allows me to move my pawn to d7, it's going to come with a check, and he's going to be forced to either sacrifice something or he could be getting checkmated here. I think I just missed that tactic. Nah, I thought rook to h1 would have won a piece, but he could have took on e2, so didn't really miss anything. All right, so bishop e7, the guy's trying to trick us. Like, obviously, we're aware that the rook is on the same line as the queen, which means if we take his bishop, he's just going to take our queen. But he's also putting his bishop under attack for no reason whatsoever. I'm just going to play pawn to e5. Now my pawn on d6 is just guarded. So Sooner or later he's going to be forced to move the bishop. Maybe bishop back to f8, but the plan, once he uses his bishop to attack my rook, I'm just going to counterattack his bishop on h5. So he plays queen to c5. Yeah, that did not help his position. I'm still not seeing what that does. We're still not going to be taking this bishop, but what I'm going to do instead is play the move knight to e4. I mean, he puts his queen on c5, so I'm just going to be attacking it. Now I'm thinking of moves like knight to f6 check, and I also forgot about the fact that pawn to d7 check was winning the game. Pawn to d7 forces his king to f8, which means I definitely need the bishop on h6. I want it to be a situation where the moment his king goes to f8, I just pull the rook back and it's going to be a checkmate. Or maybe I need to check, and then once the king moves, then I go bishop h6. Yeah, that's going to work. So he moves the queen out the way, naturally. And here's the mate that we're about to set up. First, we're going to start with pawn to d7 check. He has two pieces guarding, but we also have two pieces guarding, which means if he decides to take with his rook, that's just going to be a blunder and we're going to be taking the rook. But if he plays the move king to f8, that's when we're going to hit him with bishop h6, putting the bishop on the same diagonal as his king. And the king also has nowhere to go, which means I'm just threatening a simple pulling the rook back. And it won't matter where I pull the rook back, it's just going to be a mate. I wasn't expecting him to sacrifice the rook. He decides to sack the rook, so let's just take the rook. It's funny because it's going to be the same thing. He still has to move his king to f8, so my queen is basically going to be playing the role that the pawn was playing. The king still has to go here, and I'm still going to play the move bishop h6. So he moves the king. Let's hit him with bishop h6, and he has to be careful what he does now. I don't think there's anything that he's able to do, by the way. I'm like, my next move is to move my rook, and that will be a checkmate. Well, he decides to take the knight. Doesn't matter though, but that's just a checkmate. All right, so we're playing some Jobava game. Let's play d4. Knight f6, we're still going to be playing the move knight c3. And this is now a Joe Bava versus a King's Indian defense, which is usually going to be some very fun games, by the way. Let's just play pawn to e4, putting our pawn in the center of the board. We know what the idea is, where we're going to play moves like bishop f4, queen d2, castle the king, and especially since he's doing the King's Indian, there's just so many attacks against it. Pawn to d6 was played, regular stuff. His idea is to prevent pawn to e5. But let's just continue bishop to f4, just developing the pieces. The plan from here is queen to d7 followed by castle. And the reason why this is so good is because, the King's Indian is one of the most aggressive opening. And these are like the main King's Indian moves. But this is actually bad for black. Now I'm able to play this move pawn to e5, just like we looked on in the intro. And it could lead to a trap. Now, I'm not assuming he's going to fall for the trap, but hopefully you guys know that takes, queen takes is just losing. So he took, let's just take, attacking the knight, and okay, he did not take on d1, which means he didn't fall for the trap. But whenever stuff like this happen, and this is crucial, by the way, anytime you're able to play a move like pawn to e6, especially in the Jobava, do it. Yes, you're not necessarily blundering upon, you're sacrificing upon. Because development is actually going to be so hard for the opponent. Like, yes, he's going to take, but the pawns are going to be doubled, and my pieces are still going to be very active. And at this point, I'm going to be able to develop my pieces with tempo. So he did decide to take the free pawn. But it's very important that we're patient. Like, let's not try to win the game too quickly. So let's just play the move knight to. Actually, let's go bishop to d3. I'm going to go bishop to d3, pointing towards this g6 pawn. There's a lot of h4, h5 ideas, and then g4 is going to be weak. There's queen d2, castle, bishop h6, and I can also just develop the knight to f3. There's also knight f3, knight g5, which attacks the pawn on e6. So he castles the king. Okay. Now we play queen to d2 because the rook was also attacking our bishop. So queen d2 protects our bishop. It also allows us to castle very soon. And I'm not gonna lie, like, I'm trying to play h4, h5. Rook to e8 was actually such a bad move. I don't, guys, this was a bad move. The rook was on an open file. Why would you move the rook from an open file, put it behind the pawns? No, the rook is basically pointing towards two walls. That's crazy. Let's just get the king out the center of the board. And then the attack is going to start. H4, H5. And then the attack will start. Let's see what he's trying to do. Knight c6, normal development move. Let's hit him with h4. Pawn h5 is coming next. And we're just trying to open this h file for our rook. That's the whole idea. I'm expecting him to play an eventual pawn to e5 to attack my bishop. And based on what I'm seeing, once he plays pawn e5, this diagonal pointing towards his king becomes open. So I may go bishop to c4 and hit the king. And then if he blocks with the pawn, bishop to g5 hits the queen. All right, so pawn to e5, as we said, bishop c4, pawn e6, bishop g5 hits the queen. Okay, I actually don't like that line. I think it's winning, by the way, but I'm going to go with bishop h6 purely because the dark squared bishop is the main defender of his king. So if we're able to trade off the main defender of his king, once we play h5, then it's going to be easier to checkmate, which is why he pulls the bishop back to h8. That's actually an idea that I thought in my videos. So it's actually cool that I'm seeing you guys using these ideas. But let's play pawn to h5. Unfortunately, this idea is not necessarily going to be helping him. Knight f6 was played. And I'm still looking on this check. It's not a checkmate, by the way. Would have been a very nice mate. But once I play bishop c4, he's going to be able to block the check with his pawn. So let's just take on g6 at this point. Yeah, this may really lead to a checkmate. Once he takes with the pawn, that's a free pawn that we're not even going to take. We're going to play the move queen to g5 and attack the pawn. And then that's definitely going to be leading to a mate. I want you guys to notice that we're currently only 14 moves into the game. So this is actually pretty crazy. Let's hit him with queen to g5. And I'm currently threatening checkmate in one move. So if he's not absolutely careful, and honestly, what's the move that he's gonna play to prevent to prevent me from taking on g6 next move? Because if he guards it with the king, I have two attackers, so that doesn't help. Bishop f5 also doesn't help because I'm just gonna take and it attacks his queen. So this is basically GG's. 15 moves into the Jobava. He moves his king to f7, and this is not just checkmate in two moves. Hopefully, you guys were able to find it. But because I have two pieces attacking g6, first I'm going to take on g6 with check. The king is going to be forced to move to e5, e6, and then bishop f5 is going to be a checkmate because the rook covers the entire d file. So let's take on g6, check. The king moves, and that's just checkmate. All right, so we're playing some Jobava games. Starts off with pawn d4. Knight f6, let's just go knight c3. Like, once you play the Jobava, you're always going to play d4 followed by knight c3. Now, pawn d6 was played, and let's just go bishop to f4, the regular Jobava stuff. And I'm assuming he's going to play pawn to g6, trying to play some King's Indian type of setup, which he is playing the King's Indian. And because he did not play pawn to d5, it actually allows us to play pawn to e4. Remember this trap that we looked on in the intro? Pawn to e4 and bishop to g7 is actually losing. Like, yes, it's the main King's Indian move, but the main King's Indian move against the Jobava is actually completely lost. So he decides to play pawn to c5. That's actually not really going to be helping him. We're still going to be playing, well, I could check first, but let's just go pawn to e5 and attack this knight, which means if he takes on d4, I could take his knight. Maybe he takes my knight and I check on b5. If he takes on e5, however, then I'm just going to be taking on e5. So he decides to take on e5. Let's take back on e5. This is the whole idea that we looked on. And now if he takes the queen, I'm going to be able to take with my rook. His knight is still going to be under attack, which is exactly what we're seeing right now. Let's just take with the rook. And he's either going to be getting checkmated, losing a rook, or losing a knight. So he plays knight to a5 to attack my bishop, thinking that I'm going to be moving my bishop out the way. But let's play the move knight to d5. Knight d5 is such a strong move because, for one, I'm guarding my bishop. But that's not actually what I'm trying to do. Okay, he plays king to d8, which means he's not going to be getting checkmated. He defended against my knight going to c7, but this is just bad. Like, this is just bad. First of all, knight to b6 check. That's just a free rook, to be honest. I'm trying to see if there's a mate here, though. Okay, seeing that I'm not seeing any checkmate, let's just continue with the plan of playing. This is called a discovered attack, by the way. Not sure if I told you guys. The fact that my rook is on the same line as his king and my knight is the only piece that is in the way, I'm able to move the knight out the way. It doesn't matter that his pawn guards the square. My rook is the piece that is doing the attack, which means now he has to move the king out the way and his rook is just going to be hanging, which is why he resigns. Right, so let's get some Jobava game in. Starts with d4, as we said. After d5, we go knight c3. And the whole idea is to play bishop to f4 on the next move. Oh, immediate pawn to c5 is actually very interesting. That's very interesting. But okay, if I take the free pawn and then he plays pawn d4, knight b5 runs into queen a5. So I have to be very careful there. The thing is, though, we're still going to be continuing with the regular Joe Baba stuff. If he decides to take on d4, that's on him. I'm just going to take on d4, and yes, I'm developing my queen early, but I'm attacking d5. So if he tries to play knight c6, he's going to be blundering a pawn. So he decides to first play knight to c6, which is not bad. That's not bad. And I want you guys to keep in mind, knight to b5 here is not winning because he's able to play the move queen to a5, check the king, hit the knight, and I'm going to be forced to pull the knight back. So first, I'm going to play the move pawn to e3, which means then I'm threatening knight b5. The correct move in this position, I think, is just to take on d4, to be honest. And if I play knight b5, he's able to play e5. So if he takes on d4, then I'm just going to take back. So he did take on d4. Let's take back. And this is actually going into some very theoretical Joe Bava stuff. He needs to recognize that this knight b5 threat is actually pretty serious. So a weird looking move like knight to f6 or maybe even pawn to e6 could be trivial. Bishop to f5 was played, however. That's not a bad move. Because now if I play knight b5, he's right on time to play the move rook to c8 and defend against knight c7. Now, usually when a bishop goes to f5, we want to play moves like f3, followed by g4, followed by h4, and then just start attacking the opponent's bishop. But I'm actually going to start by playing the move immediate g4. And this is because his knight is not on f6. So because he didn't play knight f6, immediate g4 is actually a fine move. So we didn't necessarily have to play f3 in order to prepare pawn to g4. So now he just has to pull his bishop back to g6. And then from there, we could also play pawn h4 with the whole idea of trapping his bishop. Not expecting this guy to get his bishop trapped though, but let's see. Pawn to h4 threatens to trap the bishop. He needs to play either pawn to h6 or pawn to h5 if he's not trying to get his bishop trapped. So he saw the idea, which is why he played pawn to h6. And if I play bishop to d3 now, then my pawn on d4. Oh, it actually doesn't work like that. Let's actually play bishop to d3. Yes, the pawn on d4 is hanging, but if he decides to take the pawn, because my queen is on the same line as his knight, I'm actually able to take the bishop, then win the knight. So he decides to take. Let's now take with the queen, and in the same ideas of the Jobava, we're going to castle our king on the queen side and then start an attack on the opponent's king. One good thing about my position here is he did not develop any of his kingside pieces, which means it may take him a while to get his king out the center of the board. Let's get my king out the center of the board first, though. Okay, bishop to b4 was played. He's trying to develop pretty quickly. He's playing very actively, though. I'm not going to lie. Let's go knight to e2, just finishing the development of my knight. I'm also indirectly guarding my knight on c3. I don't want it to be a case where I have to move my knight away, and then he takes on c3 and double up my pawns. Knight to f6 was the move that I was expecting. I mean, the guy needs to develop. But one very cool idea of the Jobava, which is why we push these pawns up like this, is so that way we're able to play moves like pawn g5. And the normal pawn takes is actually losing because his rook is unprotected. And after takes, even if he trades the rooks, I'm not going to be attacking his knight and threatening some background stuff. So I think he needs to play immediate knight g4, just saving the knight, threatening f2. At that point, I'm actually thinking of playing pawn g6 and just sacrificing something just so that way I'm able to attack his king. Maybe it doesn't work though. So he took the pawn, and I'm sure this is losing. Let's just attack the knight. If he decides to trade rook, which he did, now we take, and his back rank is massively weak, especially since the queen and the king is on the same line. So if he moves the knight to a random square, we check. It's not necessarily a skewer. This is called a skewer, by the way, where we force the higher valuable piece to move out the way, then take the lower valuable piece. But it's not necessarily going to be a real skewer because his bishop on b4 will be able to block, but this should still be very losing. Like the guy didn't castle his king. Okay, so he pulls the knight back to d7, and we're definitely going in. Let's play rook to h1 check. Again, the king does not have to move. Like, he's able to block with the bishop, he's able to block with the knight. He chose to block with the bishop, which that was actually not the right piece to block with because aren't I able to play bishop to d6 and apply pressure to that pinned bishop? Yeah, that should be very bad for him. Aren't I able to play knight b5 and threaten some forking ideas on c7? Okay, first let's play bishop to d6. That's the principled thing to do, like PP on the PP for sure. The rook pins the bishop. Our bishop applies pressure to the pin bishop. Looks like an unprotected square, but his bishop is not able to take due to this pin. Okay, he check. I actually did not see that check. I was not expecting that move at all. But I'm just gonna block the check with the pawn though. Luckily, I'm able to block the check with the pawn. I kind of don't want him to castle his king. I think he's gonna be able to castle the king actually, but I don't want him to castle the king because if he manages to castle the king, he's gonna be a bit safer. But let's see what we're able to do. I think he's trying to castle his king, which I did not see to be honest. But let's just play knight b5. Like, and the funny thing is, this is gonna make it obvious for him to castle because this is basically forcing him to castle. I don't want him to castle, but let's see. Okay, this he probably just doesn't like to castle. Maybe he doesn't know how to castle, but castling would have definitely been the safer option there. I think he's about to lose some material finally here. I want you guys to notice how his king and his rook, they're on like a little forking pattern here. Now, knight to c7, it checks the king moves, maybe I take his bishop, but then he's gonna take my knight. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna start by taking his bishop. This is called clearance, by the way. What I'm basically doing is I'm trying to clear the d6 square for my knight. So once he takes back on f8, that's when I'm gonna hit him with knight d6, and it's just gonna be winning some material. Maybe an entire rook, by the way. So he took. Now we hit him with knight to d6. This is called a fork, which means his king has to move. And the funny thing is, once we grab his rook, the king won't be able to take. Well, the king could take back our knight, but he's also going to be losing his knight. With that being said, we could be playing this game with an entire rook ahead. So he moves the king. Let's grab the rook. His knight on f8 is now unprotected. Okay, knight g6, that was not bad. He's attacking my rook, which is the only defender of my knight. So if I pull my rook back, I'm gonna lose my knight. I'm calculating if it's possible for me to sacrifice the rook. Like, move my queen here, he takes the rook, I take with check. Oh, but then he just pulls the king back and I have nothing. So let's just save the rook. Let's not try to be too fancy. After I'm gonna play queen to b5. The guy also has only a minute on his clock here. So he took the free pawn on f4, and if I take on f4, there's queen takes f4, and that's actually very annoying. Now I'm trying to set up a checkmate here. I think I'm gonna sacrifice that knight. If I go here, he takes with check. I attack the knight because yeah, let's do that. Let's go queen b5, and also, if he takes on e2, I can also just take back on e2. But this is me trying to be a bit fancy, because I know that I'm threatening mate. He saw it, so he didn't take the knight. He decides to move his king instead. Okay, maybe now we take the knight. Oh, there's actually a very nice idea here. Oh, nah, it doesn't work. I was thinking about takes, and then if the knight takes, I check somewhere. I think it works. Let's sacrifice the knight. There's a lot of crazy stuff. If he takes my knight, there's queen a5 check, which it looks like I'm trying to pick up back the knight, but I'm actually trying to checkmate him. So he takes on e2 again. Taking on e2 here is fine. But let's just play the move king to d2. And basically, I'm trying to take on d2. Yeah, I probably should have. I think I'm being a bit fancy because now he's able to take on d4. And if I take on e2, he takes on a7. This is me being a bit too fancy. I'm going to win this game though because he has no time on the clock. So he took, let's take on e2. And then he's gonna take on a7. And okay, I'm still winning, but did not need to do all of that. So he took with the knight. Okay, check. Let's check on a5. Assuming he's gonna block with the queen, maybe check here. But this is also winning. I mean, I was about to say that I was ahead. Technically, I'm ahead because once I trade the queens off the board, my rook is gonna take, and then now I'm ahead, and there's no way for him to guard this pawn. So we're really ahead by 2 points now. But again, the guy just has no time on the clock. So this is just winning. Knight e3. Let's just attack the pawn. He moves the knight. Now we take with check. And there's something called conversion, where once you're ahead in material, always try to look for ways to sacrifice material, but he decides to lose on time.